Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael DelGiorno and David Zanotti.
There's a lot of talk going around about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, but what do those words actually mean, especially as they relate to Donald Trump?
So 5 days after January 6th, an article appears in Bloomberg that says Donald Trump isn't fit to run for office again because he participated in an insurrection. Let's capture that moment in time for a second. You're 5 days after the whole thing blew up, the whole world scratching its head going, what was that? And the Bloomberg network decides that it's going to tell us what that is. Now, a lot of people have already forgotten that Michael Bloomberg spent a boatload of money running for the presidency for about 6 weeks. And I was actually at the facility where he was holding his giant weekend of launching that campaign. I ended up sitting at 2 tables over from him in the restaurant, and I'm watching all these people from New York that have come in to make this coup. And we're sitting back quietly. I'm watching this thing, thinking to myself, why is this guy about to drop $50 million on a short-range little run? What is he trying to do? What is he trying to say? What pressure is he trying to bring to bear on all of this? Now, Bloomberg and all these folks all hang in the same circles. They're all a part of the company. They all hang around the Center for American Progress, the progressive world. They drop giant, gargantuan contributions into Soros and Podesta's networks. And there they are playing. So my question is, what game were they playing 5 days after January 6th? And guess what? Now it's all unfolding.
Well, and it presumes it's a different game because don't forget, we just played the game for 4 years with them when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. I could document, I mean, you've heard the montage where you have Hillary and Kamala and Joe Biden and everybody over and over again for 4 years. This is an illegitimate presidency. This election was stolen. So if Donald Trump even did breach Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, they'd been busy breaching it for 4 years. But if you think of it like a cake, and we have 3 layers of cake, there's different frosting between each layer. But the cake is this. Is this a constitutional crisis in demand of justice, clearly defined, or is this a political weapon and a strategy? Because if it's the latter, and I believe it is, this isn't the first time they've executed this strategy. And what's always central to this strategy is there's a play in victory and a play in defeat. So whether this Section 3 14th Amendment disqualification takes place either in blue states or all states or not, whether it fails or succeeds, well, the biggest threat is it's likely to create an actual insurrection. But at the root of it all is there is, unfortunately, no insurrection or rebellion in the Insurrection Act definition, thus in the Constitution. So how is anybody, what are the courts ever going to do with this?
So this is great. Let's tease this out for a second. Just think this through. You've got this amendment that's sitting on the books since right after the Civil War, and it's a part of the 14th Amendment, which is the package that abolishes slavery in the country. So we've got this problem. It was called a Civil War.
Right.
And a lot of people died. Billions of properties were, in dollars and properties were destroyed. But the country is as bitterly broken as it can possibly be. And now the states from the Confederacy are being invited and they are asking to return to the Union. They're trying to bring this back into a position of healing.
Because even though they lost the war, they're still divided. So this is something that was created because a country, even though it's in a ceasefire or the North won, is still divided and war could break out again. I mean, that's the context, right?
Nah, not really. No. This isn't about war breaking out again. This is about the fact that the South is broken. They are completely, absolutely broken. I mean, you can look at the life and of what happened to Robert E. Lee after the war, the few years yet that he had to live. And he basically went back to his home and said, it's over. We must find a way to reunite. He was completely done. And so were the leaders in the South. Now, there was rebellion about other issues going on in the South, particularly the absurdity and the disgust of the racial divisions which still went on. But this was not any longer about the South against the federal government. This wasn't about rebels and Yankees. These people were trying to put the country back together again. And their concern...
And they were financially broke too, right?
Well, and it was a bitter concern. Yeah, a lot of that thanks to Sherman. And remember, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by a rebel. And so the bitterness that resides in this country at this stage in the game, and now we're looking at the process of Reconstruction and federal laws and federal occupations, this was not an easy task. So the problem with the North is this. They don't want Confederate officers coming back into the Congress and taking those congressional seats so that they're right back where they were in 1850, where now there's a contention between the North and the South. There's a contention about expansion of slavery. Now, slavery is no longer possible, but it's not just about slavery. They don't want the South coming back in and exerting a dominant influence where the Confederacy, in essence, now takes its revenge inside Congress. So very simply, they add to the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that says, if you've participated in or assisted, if you will, in rebellion or insurrection against the Constitution of the United States, you can no longer take the oath of office and hold office anywhere. You cannot be a state or a federal official, take the oath of office because you broke the oath of office. You participated in an insurrection or rebellion. Those words matter, insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution. That's why they passed it. Now, within a few years, they granted 2 specific legislative acts of amnesty to wipe the law out. In essence, I'm not even sure that was legal, that you could amend a constitutional provision based upon statutory. You can't really do that. But they did 2 situations, 2 bills were passed, became laws that granted amnesty to the specific Confederate officers. And that's what happened. And so the Confederate officers were able to come back in and were able to serve. And the country did get on with what the business of the country was about. So the country did get itself back together again. That's the context of what we're talking about right now.
Right. So is the context reuniting and healing and going back to normal, or is the context protecting against militia and divide?
Well, and that
and
you
threat?
Pointed up the very first point is that what we don't see in this constitutional amendment
Is a definition because of
is the
that.
definition of what is insurrection and what is rebellion. But there's another key point. It's not defined. There's another key point in the amendment that we've got to look at. And that's not only are the definitions not defined, but this is not a criminal statute. What this basically says is it's a prohibition against you being able to be in service if you've done these following things, which are barely defined. They're only stated but not defined. So there's places where you pull on the fabric and go, wait a minute, is this apples and apples we're talking about? In addition to that, people think this is the same thing as sedition or treason.
Right.
No,
It's not.
The words are different. These are not the same words. And so you've got a difference here. And it's not rebellion against the government. Do you notice that? It doesn't say the government. It says the Constitution. So here's a question. How do you rebel against the Constitution? All right. How do you have an insurrection against the Constitution? It's a document. The idea was you took the oath of office to support and defend it, and then you participated in activities
Or
to tear
aided
down
those who
what?
did. Yeah.
Or aided those who did.
It's interesting. We looked at 3 different articles together, you and me. There was one from Bloomberg, one from the New York Times, one from I can't remember where it was.
The Atlantic.
Oh, it was your Atlantic. That was it. And of course, you could have a whole conversation just contrasting the way these 3 articles played out. I will point out the obvious in an era of death of journalism. These are technically all 3 opinion pieces, not news articles.
Very well said. Yeah, they're analysis pieces without a doubt.
But as you know, these sites or these papers, you can't tell the difference between. Remember when we were kids, there was a difference between the op-ed page and the news. Now there isn't. So technically, I'll say op-ed. There is one that actually dared in the New York Times to go through and kind of try to give you the definition that you can't find anywhere in the Constitution or Section 3. And that's the LA Times. Indeed, the evidence amassed last year in the hearings and final report of the House January 6th committee. So now we don't have a definition, but we're going to create one that's been already created for you.
By a circus spectacle of the Congress.
Exactly. All right. So by
That went on for weeks.
by congressional theater and media
Yes.
narrative, we're going to create it.
Michael began in talk radio over 30 years ago. David has been working in the field of public policy and media for over 40 years. They've been around and seen a lot. To learn more about Michael and David, visit 1850mainstreet.com.
And here's the laundry list, David, which I think it's important for you and I to visit on this. So this is what they amass as the breach of definition. Lying from election day to the present at this point. And I think they would argue today's present as well.
Yes, that's the liar, liar, pants on fire argument.
Lying from the election day to the present that victory was stolen from him. Nothing that I couldn't play you in a montage that they did from 2016 to
Can
2020.
anybody say Stacey Abrams? Okay.
Right. All right. Coercing Republican state officials, Justice Department appointees, and then, of course, the vice president. I'm going to start off with a wrinkle there because this is kind of a narrative that Pence brought forth in the first presidential debate.
Yeah, he accelerated it. Yeah.
I'm for the Constitution. I was for the Constitution. They must have stated that 5 times. The president of the United States gave me a choice between the Constitution and him. Something tells me Mike Pence is it Soros and Podesta aren't the only two wanting to play this card. Pence is wanting to play it as well. But yeah, so there we go. You know, he's trying to get state officials, the vice president, to not count the Biden votes, encouraging fake presidential electors, summoning support to the wild rally. Now we get to what I think is a legitimate criticism I have of the then President Donald Trump. He knew all this was going on. He knew the threats on the Capitol. Because remember, the Capitol Police went to the Sergeant of Arms who went to Nancy Pelosi and she didn't do anything. But they also went to Secret Service and to the President of the United States. So when the president's saying ridiculous things like, I'm going to meet you down at the Capitol, when that happened live on the air, I was looking at you going, well, this had to be not only blessed by Secret Service, but planned. Is he really going to drive down to the Capitol? I mean, we have all this stuff. But at least of these 3 articles, and you could have a conversation about the 3 different op-ed pieces, only the LA Times dared to actually lay out a point-by-point case that calls, and then they threw in, too, the call when Donald Trump had the line about terminating the Constitution, which was ridiculously out of context. But they dared to give you the laundry list. But compared to what? And what would a judge use to rule on?
Well, and this is the significant point is they're trying, and if you take a time, we got the January 11th article that came out in Bloomberg, no coincidence. And then it sat for a while because there's one article. It's like nobody has said much about it. It was sitting there. Then you begin to develop this strategy that the 14th Amendment is what's called self-executing. In other words, it's there. It sits there. Anyone can pick it up and do something with it. It doesn't require an act of Congress. It doesn't require an indictment. It doesn't require a prosecution or a conviction. It is sitting right there saying, this is what's going to happen. And so it seems like Soros and Podesta and all of their, and let's not forget Eric Holder, seemingly they all suddenly had a refresher course. They went to a CLE class on what the 14th Amendment could mean, not what it has meant historically.
And in these 3 op-ed pieces, we bring all the scholars from Yale and everybody to back it up.
So we bring in Lawrence Tribe, the progressive leftist who should have been a Supreme Court justice, who's now a Harvard guru law professor, and they match him up with a former Republican federal judge. And they come together and they sort of encapsulate this 126-page briefing that's done by these 2 Republican lawyers who basically say Donald Trump can't run for the presidency. He's disqualified. And they do in 126 pages. They basically do, I would say that it's about the level of conversation that we're having right now. It is not great legal scholarship. It's kind of a talk through. They sort of talk through what this would look like and talk through and explain why, in their opinion, Donald Trump is already disqualified. But you got to remember now, all of that is sort of batched together. Then it's shoved in the canon, all right? The giant canon, like a cartoon of the Atlantic Monthly, right?
With all the left standing around smoking, hoping to light the fuse.
And then they light the fuse and they blow it out there into the culture. And then it becomes real because now it's come to us through the Atlantic.
Well, it was written back then for such a time as now. So it was sitting there in case Donald Trump ever decided to run again.
To run for office, exactly.
By the way, just to show you how they love themselves, there is in one of the paragraphs, written with precision, the Atlantic writes, written with precision. This Harvard professor and this former judge with some assistance from two others from Yale, Jeffrey Summerfield, and I can't even do it, Anjani Yan of the Yale
Michael,
School of
if I
Management.
presented that paper in a master's class on the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and the practices of the Supreme Court, it would have looked like a junior high school paper. It's not great scholarship. It's long.
That's your opinion. In the Atlantic, they write, written with precision and thoroughness. The article makes the compelling case that the relevance of Section 3 did not lapse with the passing of a generation of Confederate rebels whose treasonous designs for the country inspired the provision, that the provision was not and could not have been repealed. Now, when I was reading that the first time, I just got to run this by you because remember I talked about the cake and then there's different frosting between each layer. Yeah. Well, this double standard is one of the frostings. So how many times does anybody ever bring up in the Second Amendment, because the most compelling part of the Second Amendment is, it is not the police's job to protect my property, to protect my life, and to protect my wife's life and my children's life and my family. God gave me that right. All right. And so that
responsibility.
And responsibility. And it preceded the government. It preceded the Constitution. Now, that's a big part. But it's also there, and in clear writing, if you read the entire Second Amendment, in case I ever got to bear arms against my government that's gone crazy. And the forming of a militia. Well, the left would tell you, you can't form a militia. That's insurrection. That's rebellion. You can't form. This is irrelevant. It's clearly outdated. The founding fathers had a reason they wrote it then, but it doesn't apply today. However, what they're attempting to do in the LA Times, what they're attempting to do in the Atlantic, what they're attempting to do in Bloomberg, and what's been sitting there like a weapon waiting to be picked up and politically used all along is, this isn't outdated. This is an insurrection.
You're exactly on it. It's like a new discovery for them. They're like, oh my gosh, we went back and read this. Look what we found.
But see, that's where I think you and I may not agree. I don't think it's a new discovery. This is remember how I always used to say to you, whenever I get in a situation where I can't figure out, it looks so stupid and obvious. I think Soros and Podesta finally ran out of brilliance and conniving ability, and now they've gone mad and stupid. And then I always go, wait a minute, Michael, take a deep breath, because they're always 5 steps ahead of you and 2,000 steps ahead of Republican leadership. That's where I disagree with you. This has the classic DNA of we got a plan whether we win or lose. Remember in our last discussion we were having at the table at 1850, we talked about this was their plan. They told them to stand down. Wait a minute, we're getting the election results, and it looks like the old man, the senile man from the basement might win. Stand down. This is going well. So they had a plan for if Donald Trump won, and then they had a stand down because it looked like Biden was going to win. So they have a plan whether he wins, a plan whether he loses. That DNA is in this.
Well, sure it
is. They got a plan if Donald Trump doesn't run. They got a plan if he does run. Hey, they've got even a bigger plan if he does win. A real insurrection.
Well, that's the whole point why it came out 5 days after January 6th, because they were already saying, and by the way, Mr. President, because he still was president at that time, if you ever think you're going to do this again, we're waiting for you. And this will be the charge. And then, of course, it makes sense because then we had the whole congressional theatrics. Remember, they impeached Donald Trump over this.
Yes.
Now, he wasn't convicted.
Twice and failed.
But they impeached him over this specific issue as well. Now, in this 126-page paper, and this is where it becomes a laughable piece, the authors try to explain the fact that even though he wasn't convicted, the fact that he was impeached was sufficient to show that the majority of votes in Congress agreed that this was an act of insurrection. Now, that's such a tortured... In other words, the indictment was brought forward, but he wasn't convicted, but he's still guilty because most of us thought he was guilty, even though we didn't choose in the legal process to, in essence, convict him.
The paper concludes in the ignorance of the public that an impeachment is guilt rather than an allegation.
Exactly. And they're trying to sell that stuff. So there's no doubt about this, that this is a very serious plan on their part. But again, the idea that they're trying to make us believe, they just went back scratching their head and saying, oh, we were reading the 14th Amendment the other day, and guess what we found?
Yeah,
well,
no.
of course, they tripped they exposed their hand way too early. They were on the 6 days afterwards, and you've got the impeachment, then you've got the hearings, and so on and so forth. So this is a plan, and it's a very serious plan. Now, we've got to get to the question of the fact that this is self-executing. And this is like a golf cart conversation. We're already done with the front nine. We got to go get something to drink and come back and get the back nine.
Or when we do that, how about all the unintended outcomes that could happen that isn't victory for the far left? In other words, whether they get them off the ballot or not, even on the ballot, the layers of ways they can obstruct in the process, which really is quite brilliant.
Watch this. That's coming.
The conversations are just getting started. To get connected, check out 1850mainstreet.com. We don't data mine anyone or sell your information. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single conversation. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.